continue tonight. Last we had ice cream afterwards, and someone came up to me during the ice cream and said, do what? Someone came up to me and said, I was really depressed by that sermon. Because Ecclesiastes looks at life and just looks at a real look at what life is like under the sun. And oftentimes it's very depressing. And oftentimes it's vanity, as the book calls it. But there's always some kind of twist to take you above the sun and see what's above the sun with life. Imagine with me that you have a novel. I have a novel, and it's 20 chapters long. And I take that novel and I tear chapter 12 out, and I give it to you. This is the only copy of this novel in the world. There's no other way to read it than this copy that I have in my hand. It's not on the internet, it's not in a library, it's nothing. I tear chapter 12 out, and then I take a match and I light the novel on fire and throw it in the garbage. And I give you chapter 12 and I say, read it. You don't read any of the rest of the novel because it's burning in the garbage pile. But you get to read chapter 12. When you read the chapter, what are some things you're going to come away feeling? Well, you're going to meet characters you haven't been introduced to because you haven't read the first 11 chapters. You're going to see a conflict that isn't established to you, and also that you won't get to see be resolved. You wouldn't necessarily know the events that had led to chapter 12 as you're reading. The story is going to feel incomplete. It is. And our lives are that chapter. Our lives are that chapter. We're born into a world and we enter into a story that we don't necessarily understand. That there are characters that are here that we don't get to see the backstory of. We don't get to find out how they came to be where they're at. I know that my parents had a childhood, but I don't get to see what that childhood was like. I don't get to stand there in the midst of the story as it happens. I know that people like George Washington existed, and their existence greatly affects the world I live in, but I don't get to see their story happen. It happened a long time ago. There are conflicts in existence when I'm born that I don't get to see start. I may be greatly affected by them, but I wasn't necessarily there to see them. I don't always know the events that led up to my coming into being. I may know the story of how my mom got married, but I don't know what countless generations have done before my parents and how the details have played out in the story that led to me being born. I've done my family tree on the internet, and as you go back really far, back in like the 1400s in Scotland, one of my relatives was, him and his wife got married. They got pregnant, and like immediately after they got pregnant, he had to go off to war. And he died in war. And so I was this close to not being born because of that one little incident. And those little details play out like that in our story, and we don't even know about them, but we're here. And we're in chapter 12. We don't know what came in 1 through 11, and we don't know what's coming in 13 through 20. We just know what's happening in our story. When we die, the story will continue on without us. The rest of the story will play out. Our story doesn't necessarily resolve at the end. We don't necessarily have a happy ending in the end credits roll at the end of our life. The world still goes on after we die. The story still continues on. It's a pretty grim reality. This is the story we live in. And Solomon recognizes that in Ecclesiastes, so he writes about it. Chapter 3. We'll read 1 through 15. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones. A time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already, and God seeks what has been driven away. A very wise monarch once said to his son, "A king's time as ruler rises and falls like the sun. One day the sun will set on my time here and will rise with you as the new king." Who was that monarch? Honey, you're smiling. Who is the monarch? It's Mufasa. Yeah, it's Mufasa. That's the story of life. It's bound. Our life is bound by time. Even if we are a nation, we have a time when we rise to the throne and a time when we die and somebody else takes over. That's the reality of life. And the reality of my life is a man's time as pastor rises and falls like the sun. One day the sun will set on my time as your pastor and will rise with someone else. There's an ebb and flow of life. There's a time for good things to happen and there's a time for bad things to happen. We try everything we can do to escape the bad things, but it's inevitable that they're going to happen. There's a time for it all. Solomon here lists out 15 kind of comparisons as he's working through this. He doesn't necessarily say either one is good or bad. He just kind of says that there's a time for them. He simply says there's a time, and for both of them, this is what life under the sun looks like. He says every matter under heaven, under the sun is kind of the theme of this book. He's talking in this whole book about how to live well in this life under the sun. And so he lays out there's a time for each of these things. That's part saying. So let's examine those. Well, first of all, there's a time to die. He starts out by bookending life under the sun. We are born and we die. The next 13 things that come are going to be things that take place between those two things. We're born, we die. All these other things are in between. This is life in our world, but it's not supposed to be that way. It's not supposed to be that way. We're supposed to live forever. There's not supposed to be death. That's the reality of the book of Ecclesiastes. He's looking at life in a fallen world, a life that sin has infected. Life under the sun is broken. Adam and Eve sinned, and we know that when they sinned, death entered the world. Nothing died before that. When they sinned, the entire universe was cracked, and death entered the world. And now, one generation goes and another generation comes. No one endures forever. People often read Ecclesiastes 3 at funerals to show that there's a time to live and there's a time to die. And there is. But it's not supposed to be that way. Even though our circumstances change, this ebb and flow happens because of sin. It's entered the world. Death is the enemy. But he says there's a time to die. There's a time to be born. There's a time to die. So you need to prepare for it. This has been one of the most weighty parts for me of being a pastor in the 6 months I've been here, is I've had to be firsthand to see die. And I had seen people die before I became a pastor, but now I have to see it more. And I communicate with people who are living their life after their spouse has passed away. And I've had had this thought in my mind the whole time I've been a pastor of, I may have to watch everyone I love die at some point. And then I'll die at some point. There's a time for it. So live your life ready to die when that day comes. Flip over to chapter 7. Hold your spot. We'll get to chapter 7 in a couple weeks, or in a few weeks. But chapter 7, verse 2. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. He says up in verse 1, the day of death is better than the day of birth. He says it's better to go to a funeral than to go to a party. Why? Well, because when you go to a funeral, you learn something from the life of the person that you're there, and you learn how to live better and how to better prepare yourself for death when you will lay in that casket one day. He says there's a time to and a time to pluck up what is planted. It's the same concept as being born and dying. It's just referring to plants and not to our lives. He says there's a time to kill and a time to heal. Now, the time to kill could certainly refer to self-defense or war or capital punishment, but I think in the context of what it's talking about, it's referring to agriculture. There was his name was Clint. Clint went to a church similar to here, a farmer. And Clint, one day got a call from one of his deacons. And the deacon said, Pastor, I need you to come over to my house. So he goes over, and the farmer's sitting on the porch with a rifle in his hand. And Clint says, how can I help you? And he's like, I need you to go over that hill. I need you to take this gun. I have a cow over there, and he's just real sick, and I need you to put him down for me. I do it myself, but I love this cow so much I can't do it. Can you go do that for me? And so Clint didn't exactly study to do this kind of thing, but Clint says, sure, I'll do that for you. So Clint takes the rifle, he walks up over the hill, and this deacon sits there on his porch, and he's just waiting. And he knows it's about to happen, and he's dreading it, but he's waiting. And all of a sudden, he hears, boom! 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 A few more shots, about 7 or 8. Pretty soon, Clint comes back over, walks up to the porch, and says, why'd you shoot so many times? And Clint says, that cow wasn't as sick as you thought he was. It's the reality of life. The same cow that you spent a ton of time healing and taking care of, well, one day you will have to kill him. And there's a time for both of those things. He says there's a time to break down and there's a time to build up. How many of you guys here love watching buildings be demolished? None of you, just me? I love it. Reed, thank you. Yeah, they put all the explosive devices inside a building. They push a button and it just implodes. It's incredible. And the buildings of the previous generation will eventually be broken down and something will be built over them. Someday your house is going to be demolished and someone is going to build over it. Adrian and I saw this a lot when a couple months ago, that there were a ton of historical buildings that were built back in 1700s that aren't there anymore. They've been built over. And I'd love to see those buildings, but they're gone. They've been broken down. There's a time to break down. There's a time to build up. He says there's a time to weep, time to laugh, time to mourn, a time to dance. That there are times that you rejoice and celebrate. At your wedding, when you find out you're pregnant, the wedding of your children, the pregnancy announcement of your children, graduations, sports championships, you celebrate those. There's also times where you weep. 2 people close to you decide to get a divorce. You or your children miscarry a baby. Someone you love dies. Someone is living a reckless life. You mourn at those moments. There's a time for that. We want all of life to be a celebration, but we live in a fallen world, and there is weeping and there is mourning. There's a time for all of it. There's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. It's difficult to know really what he's referring to, but it's most likely referring to agriculture and war. If you want to work a field, you got to clean the rocks out of it. A war strategy back in the day was you would fill up your enemy's field with rocks, and they couldn't work it. And so it'd be a war strategy. There's a time to gather stones together. There's a time to break them apart. There's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. There are times you greet close friends with a hug. My best friends in the world all live scattered throughout the United States. I don't see them on a regular basis. And I cherish those times I see them. They're few and far between. But when I get to see them, it's a time for embracing. On the other hand, there's times when you sever friendships. My best friend for 11 years of my life was a guy named Jerry. Our friendship, we were staying the night at each other's house every weekend for 10 years. And we met in kindergarten. About 10th grade is when I came to faith in Christ. And about that time, he came from a broken home and a really messed up home. He started to get into drugs and just a real bad crowd. And we never had like a moment where we were like, let's not be friends anymore. But naturally, we just kind of grew apart. Because I was pursuing the things of God and he wasn't, and we just kind of didn't associate anymore. I had another friend in college. Her name was Ashley. I was good friends with her in college. She had gone to my elementary, middle, and high school. We both went to the same college. We stayed in the same dorm, so we interacted a lot. Ashley was engaged, though. After she got married, when we would come home, we were from the same hometown, and when we came home for the summer, we would go out to eat together, even after she got married. And there came a point where I thought to myself, if I were her husband, I wouldn't want some single guy going out to lunch with her all the time. So I just chose to stop going out to lunch with her. We never talked about that, but there's a time to refrain from embracing. There's a time for both of those things. There's a time to seek. There's a time to lose. Do you remember when you were a kid and you lost something? I lost my Game Boy for like a year one time as a kid. You go into your mom and you say, Mom, I've lost my Game Boy. And she says, well, it's got to be somewhere. Well, thank you. I was really worried that it just vanished off the face of the earth. I'm glad to know it's somewhere. Well, where was the last place you left it? I don't know. That's my problem. If I knew where it was, that wouldn't be an issue. There's a time to look for something. There's a time to stop looking for it and just let it be lost. And that's what I eventually had to do. And then one day I was sorting through my closet and opened up my baseball card box, and there it was. Been sitting there for a year. I never found it, so I gave up, and then I wasn't searching and I found it. There's a time to seek out something. There's a time to lose stuff and just let it be lost. There's a time to keep and a time to cast away. There's some things we hold on to. We hold on to sentimental things. A picture of your grandmother, maybe your grandfather's Bible that has all of his notes in it. You hold on to those things. There's also a time where you come to grips with the fact that you're a hoarder and you're keeping millions of things that you don't need and you just need to get rid of them. My great-grandfather lived up in Chicago, and he died several years ago, and my parents and grandparents went up to clear out his house. They found a ton of stuff that he had held on to that he didn't need to hold on to. He grew up during the Depression, so that's what his generation did. That they were trying to hold on to things because they knew they could lose them. He kept paper plates and napkins. He washed them and reused them all throughout his house. Some people have a collection in their house and they think, I might need this someday. I just have collections of all this garbage. I might need it someday. But you haven't needed it for 20 years and you've been keeping it thinking you might need it someday. Just get rid of it. There's a time to cast stuff away that you don't need anymore. There's a time to tear and a time to sow. It's referring to, in the Old Testament, when they would mourn, they would tear their clothing. There's a time to do that. There's a time to keep silent, and there's a time to speak. Sometimes you need to keep silent when someone is in the wrong. You don't need to correct someone every single time they make a tiny mistake. You don't need to rebuke your family and your friends every time they sin. You don't have to yell at your children every time they make a mistake. But sometimes you need to speak up. I'll tell you, I'm much better at the first one than the second one. Up in the pulpit, I don't have much of a problem speaking up. But outside of the pulpit, I have a real problem saying anything against people's wrongs. I'm scared to death of it. Odds are you're good at one of those. You're either someone who needs to be more bold and speak up more, or you're someone who needs to learn to control your mouth and be silent. We usually struggle with one of those two, but there's a time for both of them. There's a time for love and a time for hate. But I thought we're not supposed to hate anybody. Well, we're not. But there are things in the world we should definitely hate. You know, there's time to be loving. There are things we should love. We should love the things of God. We should love the church. We should love our family. But there are things we should hate. We should hate the works of the devil. We should hate abortion. We should hate sex trafficking. We should hate racism. We should love the people who commit these, but we should absolutely hate them because they're the works of the devil. We should hate our own personal sin. Oftentimes we don't. We're just more annoyed with it. We don't hate it. We should hate our own sin. You see, our world has the tendency to love the things we should hate and hate the things we should love. And finally, there's a time for war and there's a time for peace. Even the most peaceful country will eventually get dragged into some kind of conflict. It's a fallen world we live in. Notice all these things are random. There are 20 things listed, 14 and 14. The writer wants you to think 7. It's the number of perfection in the Scripture. All of life is encompassed in these things. It's not all good things on the left and it's not all bad things on the right. It's not, it's this thing of, sadness one day and laughing the next and dancing the next and crying the next and building up the next and peace the next and war the next and embracing next and then keeping silent. It's just all random. It's not even which one of these things is the good thing and which one is the bad thing. Which is good and which is bad to plant or pluck up? Well, it depends on the season we're in. Which is bad, to cast away stones or gather stones together? Well, it depends. If you're preparing to farm a field, you want to get the stones out of it. If you're planning to build a house, you want to bring the stones together. Life is unpredictable, but there is a flow to it. There's a rhythm. You're going to have times of great joy in your life, and you're going to have times of great sorrow in your life. You may not understand why, but those rhythms are working good for you. Those rhythms will bring change in your life. What is now in your life is not what will always be in your life. It hasn't quite settled for me yet that I live in Georgia for good now. I've been living in temporary places since I started college. I'd live in a dorm for the fall. I'd go home and live with my parents for the winter, go back to a dorm in the spring, go back to my parents in the summer. Even when Adrienne and I got married, I moved into her apartment after we got married, and there was still this sense of, okay, we're just here until I graduate and get a church, and then we're gone. So it hasn't quite sunk in yet that I'm settled now. There's a part of me that's thinking, I'm only here, I've always only been here temporarily, so I'm going to go back home one day, right? But my life has changed now. There's a time to live in Kentucky, and there's a time to live in Georgia. We often live as though our circumstances are never going to change. Things are going to stay exactly the same way forever. That's how we live our lives. Then when things do change, we're often surprised by it and we're almost offended by it, honestly. How dare this come in here and wreck things in my life? But there's a time for everything. If you have children, there's a time to nurse the infant and there's a time to go to their high school graduation. If you're an employee, there's a time that you're the new guy. Everyone is okay if you make a mistake. And there's a time when you're a veteran employee and you should know better than to make a mistake. If you're a married couple, there's a time when you're newlyweds and you see no faults in one another. And there's a time when you're a seasoned couple who, despite each other's flaws, have a deep trust and love of all you've been through. Life is going to change. Whatever season you're in life, figure out what the Lord is teaching you in this season and figure out how He can use you in it, even if it's the worst season. I can't imagine the pain some of you have gone through losing a spouse, or losing a child, or losing a job, or having cancer. But in the midst of that pain, seek the Lord in that season. If you're in a really good season in your life, remember that life has a rhythm to it. It changes, it moves. Don't imagine there are no hard circumstances that may come your way in your future. Prepare for what God might teach you and how He might use you in the midst of that. Whatever circumstances you're in, life is going to change at some point. You can respond in one of two ways when that happens. You can fight it, you can fight the change, and it will rock your faith when that change comes. Or you can embrace it, and you can be prepared to live when those changes come if you do that. Wisdom comes in knowing when the right time for each of these. We must not hate the things that we should love. We must know when the right time to speak and the right time to be silent is. It's not. It's this husband and wife sitting on a couch, and it comes in close on the girl's face, and she's talking about how she's having all this pressure in her head, and she's just really struggling, and she doesn't know if it's ever going to end. And then she turns, and you see that there's a nail in her forehead. And the husband looks at her, and he says, yeah, I understand. You do know you have a nail in your head, right? And she's just like, it's not about the nail. I just want you to listen to me. Why are you always trying to fix me? And he's like, I'm sorry. Because there's a time to speak and there's a time to listen. You got to know which one it is. You don't want to mourn at a wedding and dance at a funeral, because those aren't the times to do those things. You must know when the right time is. And you must also understand that all these things we've seen, God does all these things. Walk through the list. Like, there's a time to be born and there's a time to die. God is in control of the cradle and the grave. Nobody is born outside of His command, and nobody dies outside of His command. We'd love to have a God that only does the good stuff, but then we'd have to have some really wonky explanation for the bad stuff. God is the one who takes our lives when we die. Nobody dies outside of God's decision to take our lives. God plants and God plucks up. God kills and God heals. God breaks down, God builds up. He weeps and He laughs. He mourns and He dances. He casts away stones. He gathers stones together. He embraces and He refrains from embracing. He seeks and He loses. He keeps and He casts away. He tears and He sows. He keeps silent and He speaks. He loves and He hates. He has war and He has peace. God does these things. You notice there's 14 good things and there's 14 bad things. That is, there's 14 pluses, there's 14 minuses. Ultimately, this life amounts to nothing in the end. Solomon's already said it. What is to be gained by all the toils in the world? It's all vanity, he says. Remember, the Hebrew word is hevel. It simply means a vapor. It vanishes quickly. It's gone. In the end, we all die, and we don't get to see how the story finishes. When chapter 12 ends, we don't get to read the rest of the novel. It goes on without us. So what do we do? Well, once again, Solomon is being really depressing here. But he comes around in verse 12. He says, I perceive that there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. What do you do when your circumstances are constantly changing and you're going to die, you're going to cast away, you're going to have all these things happen? What do? Well, you just enjoy life in God. You live your life under God and enjoy it. It says He has made everything beautiful in its time. We just sung a song based on that verse. While those good things are happening, enjoy them, because life is a vapor. Enjoy it while it lasts. But notice that line in verse 11. He has put eternity into man's heart. Many of you know I love movies, and I love good series of movies. They make a lot of series nowadays. You know, they keep making more and more sequels, and a lot of those stories, they're going to end up running into the ground if they don't stop. You know, back in the 70s and 80s, they made the original Star Wars movies. When I was a kid, they made the prequel Star Wars to show how Anakin became Darth Vader. Now they're making the sequels to show Luke Skywalker when he's old. And apparently there's no end to the Star Wars movies they're going to make. They're going to keep making them. They made Toy Story 4 recently, and if you haven't seen Toy Story 1 through 3, the story ends in number 3. Andy gives the toys away to somebody. But they made a 4. And Adrian and I didn't really like it. It kind of felt pointless because the story was finished in Toy Story 3. I did laugh a lot at it, but in the end, that was my conclusion. I wonder what you think the answer to the question is. Why do they keep making sequels? Well, why do they keep making more Star Wars movies and more Toy Story movies? You might say, well, they want the money. And yeah, maybe. But I think there's a bigger reason. We were not created to be a generation that goes and a generation that comes. We were created for eternity. God put eternity on our hearts. And sin ripped us away from that reality by making us have to live in between birth and death, where there's a time for everything. We were made to be in a world where there wasn't time constraints, but there are. They keep making sequels to movies because they want the story to go on forever, because the story isn't supposed to come. We're not supposed to die and the story continued for us. It is not supposed to end. We're supposed to live forever. But the story does come to an end for us. Sin has made it so that our story comes to an end in death, but Christ wouldn't have that. The eternal God, who has no beginning and no end, entered into our story, came into chapter 12, entered into the story. He took on flesh and bones. He was born and he died. He did this so that he could redeem us from the world of death, the world of time, the world where stories come to an end. So now in Christ we can once again, we will die, but that will not be the end of the story for us. We will live again. Time and death will not have their victory over us. Christ will show them both up. Eternity is our future. The story does continue on after chapter 12. Right now there's a time for everything. But one day there will be no time. There will only be eternity. We're going to eventually get to read the rest of the novel. We're going to eventually get to see chapters 1 through 11 and chapters 13 through 20, and we're going to be a part of a novel that will never end, a story that will never end, and that is eternity. Verse 14 and 15, I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. God has done this in Christ. He has overcome time itself. And now those who live in him endure forever. In a world where we are bound by time, understand that we're not bound by time forever. Eventually we get out of it and we live forever. Pray with me. Lord, you are the timeless God. You had no beginning, you had no end. And we live in a world that is bound by time, and that is really hard for us to grasp. I had a beginning, and I will have an end here on earth. You've never had a beginning and you will never have an end, and I can't wrap my mind around that. But Lord, you entered into our story. You took on a birth and you took on a death so that we could have eternity again, even though we lost it. So Lord, as we live out our lives right now before we get to eternity, our lives change. Our circumstances change. We grow and we suffer. We have good happen to us, and we have bad happen to us. Lord, I pray that you'll help us to learn to follow you in whatever season we're in. We're going to have really good days and we're going to have really bad days. But you're our hope. The eternal God is our hope, not our circumstances. And I pray that you would help us to learn this. In Jesus' name, amen. You are dismissed. Have a great night.